Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Pastor Eric Deepen, and across from me is Pastor Andy Littleton from
Hello.
Mission Church, and I'm pastor of the Village Church, Tucson, Arizona. And we've actually kind of been on hiatus. We jumped back in.
Well, we said we weren't, but it kept.
And then, life gets in the way. We changed our recording day.
I still think it's a better day, but somehow.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Well,
by the way, I'm out next week.
Oh, really?
On Friday. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Maybe we should just record another one after this.
Maybe, yeah, sure. I know.
All right. Well, anyway, every Faith Over Breakfast podcast is a gem because they don't come out as often anymore. And so you should listen to it over and over again. And this one I actually think is pretty thoughtful and gets right to the point. There's only 1 minute of banter. Brought to us by
Amazing.
Pepsi. Yeah.
Wow. Thanks, Pepsi.
No.
I wouldn't advise drinking a lot of Pepsi. It's not really good for you.
Yeah.
But we thank them as our unofficial accidental sponsor.
Yeah. They give us $0.
Yeah. So we're talking about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
And the war that's going on now, but especially the ways we want the people in our churches to hear this, think about this, parse this out. Again, I say this at the end, but we are not coming in as analysts or experts on the nuances of this war. We're talking as two pastors sitting down to breakfast about how people are speaking of this in Christian circles, how that gets broadcast out to the world, and how we would like to guide people through it. Did you add anything to that, Eric?
No, that was just great. And
okay.
That's very articulate.
Oh, good.
I hope everybody enjoys.
Yeah. So
thanks
for tuning in.
Hey, Andy Littleton.
What's up?
Oh, man, it's been a while. It's been a minute, as the kids say.
As the kids say, yeah.
A hot minute.
A hot minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still been warm outside.
Yes, it has.
For October, it's time. I mean, it's better.
Yeah.
Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah.
That's how it goes. The nights are cool.
All right, there you go. Faith Over Breakfast banter minute is over.
And done. Moving on.
It's been brought to you by Pepsi.
By Pepsi.
A cool drink
okay.
for you. All right. So you sent me a list of topics, and the first one was about Tupac. And so I was like, hey, I know nothing about Tupac. I boned up on Tupac, and then you sent me a text today saying, better do Israel first.
I agree. Yeah,
and,
I agree with myself.
I was a little bit more up to date on Israel. A little bit more important to me than Tupac.
Well, let's come back to Tupac, Eric. I want to make sure we do something. I feel like when you listen to the body of our work, there will be a few moments where maybe I did something that I wasn't really that pumped about.
Yeah.
So we can do some Tupac.
Yeah. This podcast.
Yeah.
But yes, I think
the entire podcast sometime at certain periods of my life.
If we were to sit down, I suspect Israel would come up if we were drinking a nice cup of coffee and having breakfast together.
I had 2 cups. So
right, and I did too, so I'm
ready.
All right, so let's do this thing.
Well, okay, so here's my first question for you with this is within let's start with your church. Let's start with the Village,
yes.
and we could talk about mission. What's your sense of how people feel about the Israel war uniquely, like compared to other wars? There's obviously Christianity has a lot of Israel woven in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of our narrative as followers of Jesus.
Massive.
So
but there are different traditions and different understandings of that.
Sure.
I know in the Village and Mission, we have people from a lot of different places and Christian backgrounds. But generally at the Village, what's the feeling about Israel and this conflict that you can gauge?
Well, I think for some people at the Village, they want to know what I think.
Yep. I keep getting that question. What do you think?
I got, I don't get it a lot. I had it, we were over at some people's house last night and they asked. Mm-hmm. But I would say it depends on the age.
Yeah.
And so if you are, I would say, over 40, maybe leaning on the late side of 40 and up, then you really are concerned about maybe what I think or about what the even sort of the theological implications of this and the end times kind of thing.
Like, where do you land on those things? Because those things start to arise in people's minds, and they want to know. I think they want to know where their church is coming from sometimes to know, am I in a safe place to talk about this the way that I'm thinking about it?
Right.
Or these are the big moments where somebody's like, is this like a home space for me? So I guess I'm saying a similar thing there, but
yeah. And I think also just like, what am I supposed to think? Like, is this the end of the world?
Yeah. What am I looking for guidance also?
Yeah. I think too, the other issues, they just tend to be more politically informed in a sense. They're digesting news at a higher rate, I think, in larger chunks. So what I would say is people under 40, the way they're digesting news is a little different, and so their conversation and thinking about it is a little different. So they're digesting, I would say, in smaller chunks.
Yeah.
And are struggling with the violence itself. Like, yeah.
Sure.
And it's pretty violent.
Yeah, clearly.
And an interesting situation in that Gaza is, in a sense, it's wedged in between Israel and Egypt.
Yeah.
And Egypt is relatively stubborn, so it's going to be wedged in between Israel and Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're not going to deal with a lot of refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's pretty crazy and violent, and Hamas is violent, and Israel's return, its response is violent.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think people are concerned about that. I think it's interesting. I don't know. It's interesting to watch our culture deal with this because it's very different.
Yep. It is. For me,
so how is it at your church?
At Mission, so far, there are a lot of people who haven't really asked or had yet.
No, it's not been a big conversation.
It's not a huge conversation. It would be a huge conversation elsewhere. I saw like Greg Laurie, famous. He's Calvary Chapel, I believe.
He stood up and talked about it in the pulpit, and I've seen a lot of people talk about it.
I've seen a lot of this. So in some churches, this has become like the centerpiece. Mm-hmm. In our church, even people asking, it's more here and there. That said, I'm going to speak of my church a little bit as the actual group that meets on Sunday, but also as the kind of the way the circle of influence that our church has. And so from a few people outside of our church who have visited, and I think would say of the churches in Tucson, ours is the one they identify with.
Sure.
I've heard a few more questions there. Some direct, just like you said, what do you think about the war in Israel? And the question I asked back was just, well, first, let me know where your head's at. Where have you? What's your background when it comes to this? And in that case, it was actually there was Catholicism in one conversation, and not really sure where the Catholic Church landed with this.
Right.
But then more recently, TV preachers and some family members that went to churches like a Pentecostal church and a Calvary church. But I think the TV presence was actually the one that sparked the question.
Yeah.
But I just know of the backgrounds in our church. There are people who, whether they're bringing it up or not, it's very present on their minds. And others where it really isn't. Like even my wife grew up in EV free and Presbyterian churches. And I've asked her before, like, when there's world events, did you grow up hearing people start speculating about the end of the world? And she said, no. I said, interesting, because I did.
Right.
The circles I grew up in, every world event, like what Greg Laurie got up and said, I thought, I've heard this 20 different times.
So maybe you could summarize just quickly what he said, because a lot of people may not have seen that.
So I didn't watch it. I saw a soundbite, so I'm not a good reporter, but just that, the time is near. Jesus is coming back soon.
Yes.
Basically.
Yes.
And you get the feeling like this is the war that is leading to what dispensationalism has been teaching us. Now, that was a big word I have to define. And so I think a lot of the systems that are saying this are heavily influenced by a 100 to 200 year old way of thinking about biblical history called dispensationalism. And in that system, which breaks redemptive history into 7 1,000-year periods, we're on the crux. Honestly, we've kind of maybe moved past for the expected switch from 1,000 years to the next. But there's an expectation that a big catastrophic war is about to happen, and there's going to be a time of increased trouble, tribulation. The church will almost be snuffed out. But at the end of that, Jesus will return in power and usher in the final 1,000-year period of history in which Israel returns to prominence, and actually the temple and the sacrificial system returns on the Temple Mount. So if you grew up in that system, that's kind of the
right. And so I mean, you hear like I have heard, just not just from my church, but just different circles that I wander around in. The red heifers being shipped over, which is a prophetic thing,
right?
I've heard in my congregation and outside the word World War III,
sure,
more than I've heard it.
And that. And some people might be connecting that to an end times expectation, or others are just afraid.
Like a geopolitical opinion.
Yep.
Yes.
Just kind of like people were speculating about a civil war in America very recently.
Yes.
Yeah. And so anyway, I think I've got that in smaller doses in my church as opposed to other churches I've been a part of in my life where it would become a centerpiece. And then, but because of how it works in our day, you could move into one of those narratives. Now, I will also say, and this is probably especially due to the refugee situation in Tucson over the years, is I had to kind of check myself, and I'm still in the middle of this, because we have a church member who descends from refugees from the Middle East, not Israeli. Even it's evident from things I asked for them to share things that they're seeing, like when things pop up on social media, and the version of it compared to what I see just naturally because of the circles I've run in is very different. Of course, we know how algorithms work. They're seeing a lot about the war crimes of Israel. They're seeing a lot. So their perception of it from the media is very different. Even I'm not like a Zionist or I'm not in that dispensational camp where I'm like, this is God, God fixing history right now in this war. It's not me, but I still see more of that perspective, as well as more pro-Israel stuff than this person sees, just by nature of where we're from, our history, our relatives. And when I looked at that those just the headings and explanations of those articles that I plan to dig into, I thought, man, we always have to acknowledge this. We see very different news. We all see very different news. It's not like when we see our news, we're picking up the same paper that somebody else was. And I think we know that, younger people. I think younger people know that, but it still affects you that you don't see the same things.
But I would say younger people are much more given because they don't, I'm going to just throw this out here. I hate to say this, but we do not have a generation. My children's generation is not a critical thinking generation overall.
They know that fact, but there still isn't like this drive to go do the work.
It's not that there aren't people within that are,
of course,
that way, but it's just as a generalization. Yeah, I mean, I think my dad, who was in military intelligence during Vietnam, always tells me, like, don't believe anything you read because it's not true.
Yeah. I
mean, now he's over suspicious, but he was, in the rooms, where people are talking about what's going on. He was on the ground. I think one of the things that's hard for me in this whole process is I don't think violence is a solution to anything, obviously, but it is a violent place and it is a violent moment. But when I think about the way the violence is carried out, it is difficult for me to handle the way Hamas brings out its violence.
And I think the thing that when I'm talking about these news stories, I have to say that was the first reports so early on, I felt the need to like just put out there a little bit like in a social media feed of just, hey, we need to, I assume we don't understand much of this journey there. Kind of, I just shared a little bit of a fact sheet on like the actual historical movements that have led to this conflict.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's pretty, since 1967.
Yep.
And it is, I mean, Jerusalem is the issue, and
Yep.
the Temple Mount is the issue.
Yep.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. This is very religious.
It is. And I felt the need to just kind of put out a little fact sheet and then kind of say that, I wanted to say this to Christians and the potential curious or non-Christians that are watching. Christians are not monolithic in their thinking about this, by the way. There are different views because actually, like in some ways of thinking about biblical structure, there was actually a judgment on Israel, in the destruction of the temple that was pretty final, that actually had a lot to do with what the book of Revelation was saying.
Yes.
And if that is your view, this is just another geopolitical conflict right now.
Right.
Like from the redemptive history standpoint, that Revelation eschatological conflict happened there. There still is a return of Christ coming, but that, like where it all melts down, is over.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't an expectation that geopolitical or religious Israel comes back at all.
Right.
In fact, those kind of groups who see it that way would say that actually unravels the gospel to say that it would.
Right.
And
you and I would probably
agree with
lean more in that direction.
I don't have like one system is
better,
I think, perfect, but I lean there.
Yeah.
Heavily lean there. And so to me, anyway, I felt the need to just say to people, Christians have different ways of thinking about this. So I even want, because I assume actually that more dispensational view that I shared is the one that's going to be the loudest, because there's a lot of,
sure.
I always say it's made for TV. It's always saying, the rapture's around the corner. It's always saying that there's like something to be very afraid of, but there's something to be really excited about at the same time. How do you not get wrapped up into that narrative? It's strong. It's just on TV a lot.
And there are a lot of people who follow Jesus very fervently and love Jesus, who believe it.
Yes.
And who are close to us.
Yes, I would say, but my sense was, and absolutely that is true.
Yeah.
And I just sense that our like young believers and people who are out in the culture are going to hear that view magnified 10 times. And I just wanted to say that's not the only way.
There's another way of reading it. I want to kind of go just a different direction, because I do have an answer for this, and it has nothing to do with the end times. I mean, I think
that's not all I want to talk about either.
Right.
Yeah,
because I think what I want to communicate to the people who go to my church and the people that I know is that it is very clear that Jesus, he only has, you could basically say, has 10 commands.
Yeah.
Within the 4 Gospels.
Yeah.
You can put them all into like 10, and those like the 10 commandments, but they all have to do with love, and they all have to do with love for enemy.
Yep.
And I think the church, if you have a pretty strong theology of the kingdom of God, meaning that in the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, there is a new kingdom, right? And it
ain't geopolitical Israel or America,
right?
Yeah.
But we are a people who demonstrate and proclaim the heart of God. Yeah. And so when there's violence, our job is to love our enemy. When there's violence, our job is to mourn death. When our job is to stand in the place of injustice. But I want to be very careful when I say stand in the way of injustice. It does not mean join a secular group who is trying to stand for another people. So one example I saw on my Facebook feed was a person standing up for the Palestinians by accusing the Israelites of atrocities, or Israel as atrocities, Israelites. But yes, anyway, and I'm like, wait, that is not how we stand. By pointing the finger, like the two people who are killing each other. We don't point the finger at the other.
And like there's two groups pointing at atrocities, probably both valid.
Yes.
And going, I'm going to choose a side.
Yeah. And I think part of what that means is, yes, some of us are in powerful positions where we can stand for justice. But for me on the ground, my job is to pray. My job is to be informed of what kind of violence is going on, and to try to communicate best as I can how God's heart grieves for what is happening. At this, and to actually move away from God is trying to orchestrate history to bring about some kind of thing, because God's sovereign will works itself out in this mess of things, and His heart grieves for all the children that are dying and all the innocence that is happening. The violence against innocents and the violence actually against those not innocent, right? There's a deep grief here because this is a product of a broken world and fallen world, and God's heart grieves over sin. He died for sin. So for me, that's the message, and the message is, how am I to love my enemy? How am I to be a good neighbor? And that's here in this community that I live in, and also thinking about what does it mean to be a neighbor to people in this world. And so those are, I think those are the places that we have to be.
I appreciate that. And this isn't even so much me pushing back, but I could just imagine in this situation or others, somebody saying, but there are times like to take a side. Aren't there? Like, you could think through a lot of different like conflictual moments, and even in American history, and say like not taking a side can be a form of taking a side. And I would, the only like nuance I would add into that is I think the majority of us who will be having this conversation here in the United States probably don't have as much business taking a side as we think. Like, we are not in the midst of it. We were not raised in this. This is not our day in, day out reality. We may not really understand. We might be being more shaped by the media presentation of it. And like your dad, I have some skepticism, not because I was in a war room, but I've literally like been represented in the media 2 or 3 times, whether it's an article or a little interview on TV. And every time I've gone, that's not what I said. They cut a third, not even a third. They cut 95% out.
Right.
Said the one thing that was the most alarming or something. And it's so even in those little experiences, I'm like, man, what we're seeing in the media
is not,
it's not it,
Well, I mean, The Village had this, great, wonderful expose done on it. We were on the front page of the Daily Star.
Yeah.
And the reporter was a Christian, and she did her due diligence.
So
and she completely misrepresented us, and we posted it. It's up on our walls because it celebrates us. But there's so many misquotes and mischaracterizations of what's actually happening. So yes, I understand. Like, The Village just got featured in a little book.
Yeah, and
if you read through it, half of the facts in it are not true.
Yeah. Well, and I think I was there for the interview for that book, and I can understand why. It was very quick, and
were you at the dinner table? Did you come to our house?
It wasn't, maybe it was one of two or something.
Yeah.
But, because it was a breakfast conversation, about it too. But, all that to say, like, so I could imagine. So one of the articles I read came from the Gospel Coalition, and the writer of it, and it had to do with Hamas and that there can't be a moral fog. And the guy is Jewish, and I'm like, he's going to see that
right
the clearest, right? And then these other articles that were shared are coming from Palestinians, and like, they're going to see, and I think there is, like, if war broke out on Arizona, and I'm in Arizona, and I feel like I understand what's going on more in Arizona, and this is my home. Like, maybe I need to be with Arizona.
Yeah.
Unless I'm like, no, this is evil, right? Like,
right. Well, let me put an addendum on what I said. I think because Jesus tells us to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth, then I would argue that we bring the gospel where we are. Yeah. So you may be called to be in the military, you may be called to be in positions of power, but you're still practicing the principles of loving your enemy. Yes. You're bringing that particular gospel, or the gospel, to that particular situation. But I would argue, when you take a side, even in World War II, where we try to hold up as the most just war, if you side with the Allies, you were siding with the bombing of Germany in ways that was wrong and utterly destructive, and of Japan.
Yes.
And you may have a bunch of moral reasons why you needed to do that, but you sided with people who will be held accountable for what they did that is unjust in a quote-unquote just war.
And if you're in Tucson, you're also siding with the internment of American citizens of Japanese origin who were forced to build our Mount Lemmon Highway for no good reason other than they were Japanese. And that is wrong.
Right. And so if you side, when you have to be very careful when you decide to side.
Well, and that's I think a long time ago I read C.S. Lewis on love of country. And as a non-American, speaking of Great Britain, it was helpful to me because he talked about how you should love your country. I was kind of in a, I felt like it was a very Christian way of thinking, in which I was like, yeah, I'm not for this country. I'm just for the kingdom of God, Mm-hmm. And he was kind of pushing back on that, saying, no, you should love your country. You should love it so much, but also perhaps love it enough to say that it's sinning. And it should be kingdom number 2 in the hierarchy. The kingdom of God should be the primary kingdom you live out of. And then because of the kingdom of God and where God has placed you, you should love and shoot for the best of and celebrate your home. And I think similar things should be the case. It should be possible for an Israeli and a Palestinian Christian right now to say, I am most unified to you, other Christian, actually, even though one of us, I love Palestine, one of us, I love Israel. And I know there is a low percentage of Christians out there. I know. But I'm just saying that should be possible. And then especially as you step away of people who aren't home, I would love to see the article of the Israeli and Palestinian Christian writing together, who both love their people and love their home, saying, we are for the kingdom of God. We are brothers and sisters. And we we are concerned. And here's how the kingdom speaks to both of these.
Right. I think I off the top of my head, I can't remember which Psalm of Ascent this is, but the line is, I am for peace. The last line of the Psalm is in the 120s, I think. Is I am for peace, but everyone else is for war. Yeah. And I do feel like in some ways that is the position of the Christian. Every time that Paul opens up his gospel or his letters, he says, grace and peace. These are the two things that I carry. That's all I got. Yeah. It's not, and that's hard, because wherever we go, we're inviting people to have for peace and the grace of God to pour out in the space.
Well, and then to offset that slightly, the most brutal psalm, and I'm always bad about numbers, and there's a 50 in there, I think, but the one where the people of Israel they're looking at their enemies who bashed their children on the stones, and they said to God, may their children be bashed against the stone. It's brutal to read. Now, I take that to be God is willing to hear the anger and the deep pain and even the longing for brutal justice from a person, even if that is not what is godly to do.
Right.
Like that psalm, I don't think is meant to be an instruction manual to us. I think you're hearing a grieving heart shrieking, and God is accepting of their pain where they are, and it's in our songbook,
right? Because
we are allowed and able to be there. So I think both Israeli and Palestinian people, like God is, and people who relate to them, right? God is okay with them. You don't have to just be like, I transcend this. I am full of love. I think that you can be committed to peace because our God is a reconciling God, and then you can be fiercely offended and angry, And God can handle both of those realities.
Yeah, that's true.
So, okay, here's a question. So I mentioned like the systems, like dispensationalism and how there's other ways of thinking, right? Earlier. Those in certain churches have formed people to think differently about this.
Yeah.
Do we, in churches like ours with people from all kinds of different backgrounds, do we need to do more of that or not really? Like, do we need to do more pre-forming? Should we have been talking about this all the time?
You mean the end of the world, or how we read Revelation and
various stuff like it's a my leaning is no, that is too much emphasis. But then again, I thought you do act out of how you've been formed,
sure,
in that thinking. Yeah.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, certainly the absence of it is forming.
Yeah,
right? So
it is.
It's saying what value you put on it. I mean, I think it's not a place that from the pulpit I think is all that important. I mean, I think, yes, if you hit Revelation, but even if I were to preach through Revelation, which will happen someday, to me it's about the victory of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Thessalonians, you're going to get into that. You're going to get into it in the Gospels.
Yeah, but it's just Jesus being victorious. I don't think that there's a way for me to determine things. And I do not think that Jesus is saying because in the age of social media and the internet that rumors of wars and I mean, and earthquakes and, and it's all happening. It's been happening since he left.
It's
what,
constant.
Is there like a people that there's no way to quantify it. Even people say, oh, it's increased. Yeah, it has population increased. Yes.
And we're now aware of all of it. Like there was a day when there were probably wars going on in parts of the country we literally never heard about.
Right. Well,
or part of the world. Sorry.
If you think of like just Native American history, I mean, the constant raiding between
they were always at war. Yeah.
Yes, and but it's 50 horse riders raiding a village of 35. I mean, it's like not the same scale kind of thing, and it's no like tweeting like we were just over at Joe's tent and we killed him.
Yeah.
And then
you don't have a little social media video where they're like, look, a guy slapped a guy.
No, it's not that. I think the information moves differently. But I think, again, it's like we focus on that and not the gospel. We focus on, it takes the eyes off of Jesus and his heart for people and his command at the end of Matthew that we go teach people to obey his commands. He did not say, go teach people the very details of how to know when I'm coming back.
Right, so that they can stock up on things and
to survive,
be scared.
And
we are absolutely not told to be scared. We're told to not be anxious, or it's one of the ways I have had some folks in the church who've been more concerned over the years, and my answer tends to be, okay, so you're looking at this stuff and you're worried. What did Jesus tell us to do day in and day out?
Right,
like. Okay, well, we're supposed to, love our neighbor, make disciples, teaching them everything I've commanded them. I'd even reach back into Genesis and say, fill the earth and subdue it. Yeah. And I say, so was there any point where Jesus said, stop doing that if X, Y, or Z is going on? No. Okay. So I think we got to keep doing that. Like, if we stop doing that, we're actually being disobedient to Jesus,
right?
Not being good followers. So it would feel like being a good follower would be like hunkering down, gathering in all the news, trying to think, what will I do if this blows up?
Right. Well, I watched a clip from a very conservative, video podcast, and the guy is very famous, and he's talking about he's creating fear. He's saying, all right, make sure you know where all the exits are. Avoid cities.
Yes.
I'm like, wait, what? We cannot.
That's all the stuff that avoid cities. Get, it's like all of a sudden it's like live off the land, get some chickens. Like, wait, is that what Jesus was saying? Like, I don't know.
Right. Well,
sorry, back to you.
Well, no, that's just my thing is I think Thessalonians is pretty clear that like we're not supposed to stop working and the gospel should make us a peculiar people.
Yeah,
that's what should. And the gospel is about Jesus. It's about the love of Jesus on the cross, the victory and the resurrection, and the life change that brings through the Spirit. Like that's what we're about. That should make us peculiar, not hunkering down.
It's like just to imagine it, just working out what you're saying right there, the peculiarity of the Christian, how secure they would be in the providence and the goodness of God, of the kingdom of God that stands over all the kingdoms of the world, of the hope that we have in the gospel that transcends all other stories. And it would be like if war actually broke out on our block, like in our part of the city, that the Christian would be the one who would try to go to sleep, wake up in the morning, go to work, look for people no matter what side they were on that needed bound up and loved and helped, and who stayed fully engaged and spoke to them of the love of God that is greater than these two kingdoms that are warring around us, and who wouldn't be, have an absence of fear, would take all those fears right to the heart of God and yell and cry and scream, but would anchor themselves and keep walking in what Jesus has called us to do.
Now, the addendum I would put on all of that.
Good. Put it.
And this is where I think, people who are looking at things and worried are actually right. I think there's no problem with you looking around and saying, wow, this looks dangerous. Mm-hmm. I'm going to stock up on some food. I'm going to become more self-sufficient. I'm going to think through all of this. Yeah. But not so that I can be safe, but that as people out in the world, like when bad things happen and they're not prepared, I am, and I can open my doors and show the love. Then
even your enemies.
Yeah. If I can prepare to love my enemies, then prepare because you're watching and you're alert and you're sober-minded. And so you begin to do that perfect reason to buy your, year supply, buy 5-6 year supply of food and stuff so that you can give it away when things
dig a bunker you can invite people into.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm serious about those things. If these are the things you're called to and that's what the Holy Spirit is putting on your heart, then do them. Be ready to share them with people you disagree with.
Yeah.
And who may be what you would call your enemy.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. All right. Well, I think I appreciate that, Eric. Thanks. And anyway, I would say if you have follow-up questions, listener, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. Yeah, right. Like if you go, wait, I think you missed a big element of this, or I'm seeing something different, we can follow up on that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, neither of us feel like the expert on Middle Eastern events, by the way. Like if we've missed nuances here, I believe we have. We're kind of local pastors that are, doing various things around town, and this is not our. We're not coming out of the study.
Well, this is Faith Over Breakfast.
Yeah, we're
it's
having
you
a
and
breakfast.
I kind of going blah. Or see you at your.
But I do think and hope there's some value in listener, getting to sit with us and hear how we're thinking here. So, and if you have questions about that, faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com, let us know.
All right.
And also, by the way, we haven't said this for a bit, but if you rate our little podcast, it makes a big difference.
It does.
And so we really appreciate our listeners, and we would love if you gave us a rating, and that would just help us pop up a little more out there. We've been doing this for years. It's simple, but we think it's good, and we hope you share it.
You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.